It was 3 in the morning when Margaret woke up screaming. Her blue eyes, once so sweet, were filled with pure terror. She pointed at Richard, her husband of 52 years, as if he were a dangerous stranger. "Who are you? What do you want in my house?" Her trembling voice cut through the pre-dawn silence like a blade. Richard slowly extended his hand, like someone trying to calm a wounded animal. "Maggie, it's me, Richard, your husband." But she recoiled, hitting her back against the wall, her fingers clutching her nightgown as if it were her only protection. The man who had held that same hand at the altar, who had caressed her hair during 3 childbirths, who had danced with her in the kitchen on Sundays, was now just a haunting phantom in his wife's fragmented mind. The clock on the wall ticked off the seconds with cruel precision. Each tick another memory disappearing forever. Richard silently stepped back, his shoulders stooped under the weight of a nameless grief. Later, sitting in the dark kitchen, he held a yellowed photo from their wedding. In it, Margaret smiled radiantly, her eyes shining with a happiness that was now lost in the twisted labyrinths of Alzheimer's. But to understand this moment, you have to go back to the beginning. If you've ever cared for someone who forgot your name, leave a comment. Your story matters too. Margaret was the kind of woman who made the whole house smell like cinnamon every time she decided to bake an apple pie. Her hands always found an excuse to touch, a gentle caress on Richard's face when pouring coffee, a ruffle of her grandchildren's hair, a long hug for her grown children. She had a knack for making anyone feel special with a simple look, as if you were the most important person in the world at that moment. Richard could still hear her laughter echoing through the corridors of his memory. It was contagious laughter, starting softly and growing until it filled the entire room. They had sacred rituals. Breakfast together every day at 7:30 a.m., walks in the park on Saturdays, and always a goodnight kiss, even after the silliest arguments. Margaret never forgot important dates and had a photographic memory for details. She knew exactly how everyone liked their coffee, remembered the names of all the neighbors and their life stories. The first signs were so subtle, they seemed like just traits of aging. She started forgetting where she'd put her keys, repeated the same story 3 times in the same conversation, sometimes stood still in the kitchen without remembering what she was doing there. "It's just stress," Richard told himself. "We're getting old, it's normal." But deep in his heart, a voice whispered what he refused to accept. It wasn't just age. Something was stealing his Margaret piece by piece, memory by memory. If you also miss a voice that no longer remembers yours, comment "I hear you," and tell us what city and country you're watching this story from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support more stories like this. The diagnosis came on a regular Tuesday in March. The doctor, a kind, grey-haired man, held the test results in his hands as if carrying a bomb about to explode. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Thompson is in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease." The words floated in the sterile room's air like a death sentence. Richard felt the world collapse beneath his feet, but Margaret, sitting beside him, simply squeezed his hand and whispered, "We'll face this together, my love." Ooh. In the following months, small losses accumulated like drops forming an ocean of pain. Margaret forgot her youngest granddaughter's name, then could no longer remember how to make her famous apple pie, a recipe she'd memorized 30 years ago. She'd pause mid-sentence, searching for words that seemed to have evaporated from her mind. Richard started writing everything down, every moment of lucidity, every genuine smile, every "I love you," said with full awareness. One May morning, Margaret woke up and looked at Richard as she always did. Her eyes lit up with that sweet, familiar recognition. "Good morning, my dear Richard," she said, and kissed his forehead as she had for decades. He didn't know it would be the last time. The next day, when he woke up and tried to kiss her, she stared at him with confusion. "Excuse me, sir, but who are you?" Richard's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces at that instant. From that morning on, Richard became a stranger in his own home. Margaret would ask for her husband to the man who had been there for 52 years. She would ask to leave because she needed to go home, even though she was in the place where she had raised 3 children. Richard learned to say yes, dear, to almost everything, because arguing only agitated her more. He discovered that love could also be made of white lies and forced smiles. Nights became a waking nightmare. Margaret would wander the house looking for people who had already died, talk to reflections in the mirror, thinking they were visitors, hide objects in impossible places. Richard slept with a keen ear, ready to rush at the slightest sound. He had become a silent guardian of someone who no longer knew she needed protecting. The children came to visit, but the visits became more spaced out. It was too painful to see their mother ask who they were, to see her scream when they tried to hug her. "It's too much, Dad," said Sarah, the youngest daughter, with tears in her eyes. Richard understood, but he couldn't abandon Margaret. How could he abandon half of his soul? Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided conversation. Richard's world shrunk until it fit only in the space between him and a woman who wore his wife's face but harbored the soul of a frightened stranger. He started forgetting how to genuinely smile. One afternoon, while helping Margaret bathe, she looked at him and asked, "Do you have family?" Richard swallowed his tears and replied, "Yes, I do. A wife I love very much." Margaret smiled sweetly and said, "How lucky she is. You seem like a very good person." In that moment, Richard understood that Alzheimer's hadn't just taken Margaret's memory. It had taken her identity, her place in the world, her very existence in the life of the woman he loved most. Do you remember the last time someone special said your name? Write it here, before that memory also fades. Richard's routine became governed by an invisible, merciless stopwatch. 6 a.m. Wake up before Margaret to prepare her medications. 5 blue pills, 3 white, 1 yellow cut in half. 6:30 a.m. Help her out of bed, guiding her to the bathroom because she had forgotten where it was. 7 a.m. Breakfast, with him cutting everything into small pieces because Margaret had lost the coordination to handle utensils. 8 a.m. The first crisis of the day. She didn't recognize the bathroom and refused to use it. The medications had to be hidden because Margaret would spit them out, thinking they were poison. Richard learned to mix crushed pills into her food, feeling guilty for deceiving her, but knowing it was the only way. He put child locks on all the cabinets after she tried to drink detergent, thinking it was juice. The house that was once a home became a secure prison with invisible bars made of love and despair. Nights were the worst. Margaret would wake up confused, sometimes 3 or 4 times. She wandered the halls looking for her mother, who had died 20 years ago. Richard followed her from afar, ready to catch her if she stumbled. He'd been sleeping a maximum of 2 hours straight for months. His eyes were 2 deep craters, his beard grew uncared for, he had lost 15 pounds without realizing it. Friends asked if he was sick. He'd smile and say he was just tired. Margaret started confusing day and night. She wanted to go to work at 3 in the morning, wore her winter coat in summer, tried to cook scrambled eggs in a cold pan. Richard became her eyes, her hands, her memory. He spoke for her at the doctor's, chose her clothes, cut her food, brushed her teeth. The independent woman, who had raised 3 children alone while he traveled for work, now needed help even to drink water. The children stopped visiting regularly. "It's too hard, Dad," David repeated on the phone. "Mum doesn't know who we are. She gets agitated when we arrive." Richard didn't judge them, but he felt a loneliness that cut to the bone. He had become an island in a desolate land, caring for someone who didn't know she was being cared for. The house fell into permanent silence. No visits, no phone calls, no coherent conversations. Richard started talking to himself, narrating his actions aloud just to break the suffocating silence. "Now we're going to change your clothes, dear. It's a beautiful day outside." Margaret would look at him suspiciously, as if he were a well-meaning intruder. The social worker showed up on a rainy Thursday, a young woman with a clipboard and a worried expression. She observed Richard with clinical eyes, noticing his paleness, his trembling hands, his way of speaking too softly. "You can't go on like this," she said gently. "Your wife needs professional care." Richard shook his head. "I can take care of her." But even he knew he was lying. One morning, Richard broke down. He was trying to bathe Margaret, who was screaming and struggling, thinking he was going to hurt her. She scratched his face, leaving 3 red marks on his cheek. For a second, just 1 second, Richard felt anger. Anger at Alzheimer's, anger at God, anger at Margaret herself for not remembering that he loved her. He locked himself in the bathroom and cried like he hadn't since he was a child, his sobs muffled by the towel so Margaret wouldn't hear. If you've spent entire nights awake for someone who didn't even know you were there, this part is for you. The accusation came on a Sunday in August, when the heat made everything even more unbearable. Margaret, her eyes filled with a fury Richard had never seen, pointed a trembling finger at him and screamed, "Thief! You stole my money!" She had hidden her wallet inside the oven and of course didn't remember. To her confused mind, Richard was the only possible culprit. He tried to explain calmly, to show her where the wallet was, but Margaret had already decided he was the enemy. From that day on, every gesture of affection was interpreted as a threat. When Richard tried to help her get dressed, Margaret would yell, "Let go of me! I don't want you to touch me!" When he served her food, she was suspicious. "You put poison in my food!" When he tried to give her medicine, she'd spit it out. "You're trying to kill me!" The man who had dedicated 2 entire years of his life to caring for her with infinite tenderness was now seen as a monster. Neighbors started hearing the screams. Margaret would scream for help, say she was being kidnapped, bang on the window asking for assistance. Richard saw curtains move, suspicious glances when he went out to buy groceries. He started avoiding eye contact, walked with his head down, felt the weight of silent judgments. "Why doesn't he put her in a hospital?" people whispered. "It's not normal for a woman to scream like that." Sarah, the youngest daughter, showed up one tense afternoon. She had received a call from a neighbor, concerned about the strange screams coming from the Thompsons' house. Sarah found Richard exhausted, with deep, dark circles under his eyes and a sadness that seemed to have permanently settled on his features. "Dad, you can't go on like this," she said, avoiding looking at Margaret, who was sitting on the sofa muttering disconnected words. The family met without Richard knowing. David, Sarah, and Michael made a decision they deemed necessary. It was time to admit Margaret to a specialized clinic. "Dad is killing himself," Michael argued, "and Mom is suffering too. She needs professional care." But when they confronted Richard with the decision, he categorically refused. "I won't abandon her," he said with a firmness that surprised even himself. She wouldn't understand. She'd think I truly abandoned her. The children insisted, argued, pleaded. Sarah even cried, saying she felt as if she was losing both parents at once. "Look at you, Dad. You're skeletal. You don't sleep. You don't eat right. How are you going to take care of her if you collapse?" Richard knew she was right, but something inside him refused to accept it. Admitting Margaret would be admitting defeat. It would be breaking the promise he had made at the altar. In sickness and in health, till death do us part. The social worker returned, this time accompanied by a nurse. They talked to Richard for 2 hours, explaining the benefits of a specialized clinic, how Margaret would receive 24-hour care, how Richard could visit her every day. "Sometimes loving someone means letting them go," the nurse said gently. But Richard could only think of Margaret asking for him in a strange bed, surrounded by strangers, not understanding why she had been abandoned. One night, Margaret had a particularly violent outburst. She broke 3 plates trying to defend herself from Richard, cut her own hand on the shards, and when Richard tried to clean the wound, she bit him until he bled. It was at that moment, with blood dripping from his arm, and Margaret screaming profanities she had never used in her entire life, that Richard seriously considered institutionalization for the first time. Maybe the children were right. Maybe he was no longer capable of caring for her adequately. If you've ever been blamed just for loving too much, tell us in the comments. This space is safe for you. The decision to step away, even temporarily, nearly killed Richard. He stayed at David's house for a week, just to rest a bit, while a professional caregiver stayed with Margaret. The first night away from home, Richard couldn't close his eyes. Every sound made him think Margaret was calling for him. Was she scared? Was she asking where he had gone? Had she by some miracle regained her memory and was waiting for him? David tried to distract him, took him out to lunch, put movies on TV, talked about work. But Richard was a ghost wandering through his son's house. He picked up the phone to call home 10 times a day, always giving up at the last minute. The caregiver had been instructed not to let Margaret answer the phone. Calls agitated her too much. Richard felt like an exile from his own life. On the 5th day, the caregiver called. Margaret had stopped eating completely. She spent the entire day sitting by the window looking out at the street as if waiting for someone. "It's common when there's a change in routine," the professional explained, "but she's getting very weak. I think it's best if you come back." Richard didn't wait for her to finish the call. He grabbed his keys and drove home at a dangerous speed, his heart pounding as if it would burst from his chest. When he opened the door, he found Margaret exactly as the caregiver had described, sitting in the armchair by the window, thinner than she had ever been, her gaze lost on the empty street. She didn't even look up when Richard entered. "Maggie," he called softly. She slowly turned her face, and for a second, just 1 second, Richard saw something familiar in those blue eyes. It wasn't exactly recognition, but it was connection, as if some deep part of her knew he was important, even without remembering why. Richard approached slowly, as he always did now. "Can I sit here?" he asked, indicating the chair beside her. Margaret nodded almost imperceptibly. They sat there in silence for an hour, just looking out the window together. There were no words, no shared memories, no conscious recognition, but there was a peace Richard hadn't felt in months, as if in the silence they were just two tired souls finding comfort in each other's presence. That night, Margaret let Richard help her bathe without screaming. She didn't know who he was, but she seemed to trust him intuitively. When he brushed her hair, now whiter and thinner, she closed her eyes and sighed contentedly. These were small moments of connection that didn't depend on memory, that came from a place deeper than the brain could reach. Richard started playing the piano again. He had stopped months ago because Margaret got agitated by the noise. But now, when he played the old songs, the ones they danced to when they were dating, Margaret would be quiet, sometimes even smile. One afternoon, as he played The Way You Look Tonight, Richard heard a sound he hadn't heard in over a year. Margaret was humming. She didn't remember the words, but the melody was there, safely stored somewhere in her mind. It was then that Richard understood something fundamental. Their love hadn't disappeared with her memory. It had transformed into something more essential, more pure. It was no longer based on shared memories or words of affection. It was made of silent presences, of care without expectation of recognition, of a connection that transcended the need for names or stories. Richard had learned to love without being loved back, to care without being remembered, to exist in the pure present of each moment. Do you believe love can endure, even when memory fades? Share this story with someone who still believes. Margaret's last months were the quietest of their entire history. She began sleeping most of the day, waking only to eat small portions of food that Richard prepared with infinite care. Her words became increasingly rare until they disappeared completely. But Richard had learned to read her new language. The relaxation of her muscles when he held her hand, the small smile when he sang softly, the way she snuggled when he adjusted her pillow. Richard started writing. First, they were simple notes about Margaret's care, then it transformed into something greater, their story, told from the perspective of someone who still remembered. He wrote every night after Margaret fell asleep. Each page was a way to keep alive the woman she had been before Alzheimer's took everything away. He wrote about their first meeting, about the disastrous marriage proposal, about the birth of their children, about all the small joys that built a lifetime together. Margaret Rose Sullivan Thompson, he wrote with careful handwriting on the first page, born March 15th, 1947, daughter of hard-working Irish immigrants, retired elementary school teacher, mother of 3, grandmother of 7. The woman who taught me that love is a verb, not a noun. He knew she would never read those words, but writing was a way to resist forgetting, to prove that she had existed, that she had been loved, that she had mattered. One December morning, Margaret didn't wake up. Richard realized it when he went to bring her breakfast and found her eyes closed, but with a serene expression he hadn't seen in years. There was no struggle, no pain. She had simply passed away in her sleep, quietly as she had become in recent months. Richard held her cold hand and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me to love without being loved back, Maggie. Thank you for letting me care for you until the end." The funeral was small, just close family and a few old friends. Richard read an excerpt from what he had written about her. "Margaret did not die when she stopped recognizing me. She died when her heart stopped beating. Everything that happened between those two moments was love in its purest form, without expectations, without memories, with nothing but the daily choice to care for someone simply because she existed and deserved to be loved." Months later, Richard decided to share the complete story. He created a blog called Where Names Still Live, dedicated to telling stories of anonymous caregivers who love without expecting recognition. The first post was about Margaret, accompanied by a photo of her smiling in the garden before Alzheimer's. In a few days, hundreds of people had shared their own stories in the comments. Children caring for parents who didn't recognize them, devoted spouses to partners who had forgotten their own names, entire families united by the invisible thread of selfless care. The blog grew organically, becoming a meeting point for invisible caregivers worldwide. Richard received messages from people thanking him for putting into words what they felt but couldn't express. "You helped me understand that I'm not alone," wrote a woman from Argentina. "My mother also forgot my name, but now I know that the love I feel for her is real, even when she can't reciprocate." In the last post about Margaret, Richard wrote, "She forgot my name, she forgot we were married, she forgot we had children together, but I will never forget who she was, how she laughed, how she loved me when she could still remember how to do it. Alzheimer's can steal memory, but it cannot steal the love we choose to give every day." Margaret Rose Sullivan Thompson existed. She was loved, she mattered, and as long as I live, her name will live on. If you care for someone who no longer knows you exist, share this story. In every city there's an invisible caregiver, and their love deserves to be remembered. 6 months after the funeral, Richard found a yellowed paper among the pages of one of Margaret's recipe books. It was a note she had written in the early stages of Alzheimer's, when she still had moments of crystal-clear lucidity. In shaky but recognizable handwriting it read, "To my dearest Richard, if I ever forget your name, it doesn't mean I've forgotten you. Love is kept in a place deeper than memory. Thank you for staying with me, even when I no longer know who you are. Your Maggie forever." Richard held the paper against his chest and cried, but this time they were tears of relief. She knew. Somewhere in her ailing mind, Margaret had known what was coming and had left this gift for him to find when he needed it most. She hadn't forgotten completely. She had forgotten names, faces, stories, but she hadn't forgotten how to love. Today, on Richard's nightstand, there is a photo of Margaret smiling and an open notebook on the page where he writes every day. Margaret Rose Sullivan Thompson, loved, remembered, eternal. Because sometimes when all names disappear, love is the only word that remains. Memory may fade, but love stays to remember who we are. She forgot who I was, but I never forgot who she was. Not every goodbye is spoken. Some happen slowly, in silence, every single day. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if you know someone who has gone through or is going through something similar, your likes and subscriptions help more people find stories like this. And remember, somewhere in the world, there is someone loving without being remembered, caring without being recognized. That person deserves to be seen. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any story that can change your perspective on love, family, and what truly matters in life.